Welcome to Warblog. Today I'm going to look at something on page 3, continually battling on the backlog, continually facing outstanding content going back to page 3. One more of these and I'll be getting closer. But anyway, so I've just done this, quite simple, straightforward scenario. The only thing to note about this is that it didn't happen. It came about sort of around the time when there was a little bit of momentum from the Houthi side, and the report sort of indicated that this was the next thing, because I think they'd just taken Maas camp, which is under here, which is a big strategic sort of position, and I think the implication was that, and they sort of took much of this road quite quickly after that, so they'd sort of taken this and broken through along this road, and Marib would be next. But it doesn't look like that happened. To put it into a little bit of perspective, the next scenario, which is well, not the next scenario, there's another one here. This one is pretty much exactly the same thing. What you'll see is there's Kanaisi camp. Obviously there's Marib, so it's just a fractionally more zoomed in. So if there's Wadi Maas and Asada, Wadi Maas I think is there. No, there's Wadi Maas. So we've basically got this map duplicated from there to there, so it's zoomed in almost just marginally, and that happens from time to time because I see the reports, I think, oh, I better do that, and I'd add it, and then 3 months later, 4 months later, November, December, January, February, 4 months later, I still haven't done it. And so I don't mind duplicating things, and but obviously it was still something that was in the news as sort of something that was happening, the next thing. But I looked at the South Front thing again recently, sort of yesterday-ish or today-ish. It's still the 6th, isn't it? And they don't have Marib, so it didn't really get any further. So I'm just going to play it as a song. So this is a what if. I don't do what ifs, in the general sense, but this is the strategic situation at that time. Obviously, it's probably more detailed and structured than this. I don't know. I mean, whether or not these solid defensive lines exist, I don't know. I always feel like I put too many units on, but it's sort of almost just to give a sense for what's happening. But anyway, so we're trying to break through to Marib, and obviously these bases and camps around here. So obviously there's the front line. We'll point there. Obviously they've broken down along the road. So something like that. Now, what they're actually doing is sort of fighting along here, to some extent along here, and obviously they're trying to battle down here, but these were the lines. I think there's sort of a line here and a line here. But there is also activity here, but not necessarily at the same time. And so I think you've got to maybe consider, well, this is probably no man's land. Well, we've got this little base up here where I put all these Saudi mechanized units. So, what you do is really, open for the imagination, really, because it didn't happen. But you might have thought, well, open for consideration or analysis or debate, because you might have thought that they could, you should see what yellow looks like, push down this way through all this open ground. And the thing is, because I haven't really looked at this before or played it, I don't know how strong this defensive line is or what, whether that could happen. I mean, obviously this route would be the more attractive because it's the road, and that would be what you would be looking to do. And this is probably why they've got this down here. So, as ever, because I don't want to play for too long, I would sort of think, well, what sort of strategy would I be playing? And I think essentially the game doesn't really have any sort of any form of, sort of command and control, in that there's no activations or there's no sort of limit to what you can move. There's no command radius for units. Everything can move in sort of perfect synchronicity and harmony. But you could say that I mean, I've said this a number of times before. You could say, well, it's simulation as much as anything else. What would you do in the sense of, well, also sort of considering what I was really applying just a few moments ago, consideration of what I've always called battle groups, where you'd say, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do, and this is my reasoning. Almost as though you'd have an umpire or something, and so you would say, well, what are the battle groups? Now, you could look at this, say, tactically or specifically. So, for example, we could sort of quite often, I mean, I'm not going to go through all this now because I'm not analysing the situation, but if I were, I might sort of highlight, for example, this point here as a sort of a stronghold. I might want to sort of define this as a group, this as a group, this as a group, or these three as a group, these two as a group, or all of this as a group. And so these would be sort of battle groups or opposing battle groups. And then you could sort of say, well, what else have we got down here? Well, obviously we've got maybe the sort of the road battle group, and then we've got this southern intervening period here. And then we've got maybe this as one, if you wanted to describe it as one, or you could set it up as two. However you want to define those sort of, those groups, and then you would say, okay, well, what else is there? So, well, we've got our offensive group. So obviously we've got a fairly significant battle group here that we could say, well, this is what we're doing here. And we've got maybe sort of this front line unit that we could say, well, these are part of the same force, so we'd have these, for example. I'm not looking at the detail or how I feel it should be played, but I'm just almost sort of picking things out semi-randomly, really, just to sort of demonstrate, say, the concept that I was just trying to refer to, as opposed to sort of promote. So you end up with all these battle groups. And you would say, okay, well, because we're not using, I'm just actually just doing it as a default, and then obviously we've got some reserves. So we would say, okay, well, this is what we've got. And then you would say, well, this is a command element. And you're just looking at that, and we're not saying it is, but you could say, well, it is. And there's a reserve there, for example. So you define everything, and you say, well, what I'm going to focus on is, because I want to sort of play in a sort of semi-realistic, simulated fashion, as opposed to just moving everything, you're going down the line and moving everything, you might say, well, what is actually happening? And as I've sort of intonated, the action is sort of happening here. If you look at the link, it actually sort of shows where some of the action was happening. We might want to say, okay, well, we're going to activate this group, and my objective will be to, so you might sort of draw those lines up, and it's going to be different for every situation and for every player and every person. Have we used yellow? Yes, we have. Let's use green. So you might put a hold with this, but you would put an advance on this, and a hold, and let's just, for sake of argument, a hold a hold, a hold. But you might sort of say, well, you know what? I'm going to convert this into an advance. And so you say, okay, well, I'm going to play this. Right? This little group that I defined completely without reason, you know, because you're building your story up of what you're doing, because it's not just a case of playing Sudoku where you're just following the rules and jumping in. And that's something that I quite often comment on, really, with regards to how I see a lot of games played. There's just sort of, you know, people quite often just jump in, especially with the online computer games, and just start moving everything. And you think, well, have you considered anything? You know, have you done any thinking? Because obviously we know that we've got this many units, we could move them here, but you know, is there a reason and rationale? And this is how these things are actually happening. So we could say, well, I'm going to advance with this, but this is going to be an advance, but only to put pressure on this line, for example. So we're not going to advance beyond. So we could say here, our objective is to essentially to advance to take this line. So once we've taken that line, we're not going to advance anymore. Now, if this was a super duper computer simulation, you could actually almost program that in. Not so much program it in, but I know there are some games where it's advance and hold, and then you give them all these orders. It's sort of like a defensive advance or an advanced defensive, or you know, hold and fire or hold and retreat or something, just sort of some command. And you know, it's one of these games. I've got one in mind, but a lot of these things, you sort of think, well, what sense does this make? And then you get other games. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of things, but I've played the I think it's the Avalon Hill American Civil War series, and you get a series of activations, and you can only activate certain things. And you could say, well, what does that mean? Well, it sort of means that, you know, to some extent, that strategic initiatives are seldom complete across a line. You know, no one just sort of thinks everyone charge. You know, that doesn't sort of happen. People think, well, you know, all lines will be static. I mean, we're in different ages, you know, because we've got mobile and mechanized warfare, so it's slightly different, and this is why a road sort of becomes a lot more important. But in this instance, what we're going to say is we want to take this. Let's use something that's going to be brighter than that. We want to take that, because then we will be able to advance along there. So that's our mission. Everything else is going to be on a hold, and this we're going to take. We want to displace these 3 units to put some pressure. And maybe we could say, well, the reason for that is because we're going to create a pincher here and a pincher here, resulting in, you know, this bottleneck only being that wide, which would essentially mean, running out of colours, that all of this could be caught up in a pocket, for example. And again, just sort of have a quick last look at all these amazingly squiggly lines, and again, to sort of reiterate, this is just the thinking, and this is just the consideration. And you sort of think, well, you know, this is sort of what it's all about. We haven't moved any counters yet. And you could sort of sit there and say, well, we know our objective is actually very different. You know, so I don't interpret it in the same way. You know, and I think that this is something that is, I wouldn't want to say missing, but I think the dialogue, the form of dialogue, and what I'm trying to maybe convey in these sorts of situations is that, you know, the strategic thinking is maybe, you know, as enjoyable as the actual moving of things about, etc., etc. So I'm going to sort of start doing things based on my 2 whatsits. So I'm basically going to try and take these out, and I'm going to try and take these units out. Now, I can't even remember exactly what I said I was going to do, and what was in one group and what was in another group, but that's going to be my general intent. So essentially, we start to look at this and we say, well, this is this is our Kissarat initiative. We defined it as that. We know that between Kissarat and Marib, there isn't anything. So in theory, we should have an open road that we can take, but we've got quite a sizable unit. So then we start saying, well, what have we actually got there? We've got 3 infantry companies and 2 infantry, one infantry company there and 2 there. And we can sort of say, well, what have we got and how can we do that? So you can start to sort of like get quite specific into just this singular little region. And I'll quite often, make a fairly significant point of using the smaller maps because I like the smaller maps. But we've got 2 distinct fields of activity here. We've got this section up here. We might say, well, we can't actually take these units. Now, what do we have? How significant are these as entrenched units? And what's the importance of this, sort of more independent mechanized unit floating around as a sort of reserve? Is that actually going to affect things? Then we should be able to sort of get at least 3 of these against that. That will give us like 15-2. So that would be sort of like a 7-1. So we should be able to take that. But we don't have the same odds against this because we don't have the manpower. So we've got 1 unit there. So we get a 2-1 there and a 2-1 there. Maybe we could spread him out and put him over there. But they're all foot units. So we could possibly get 2 against that, 1 against that, and 2 against that. But we can maybe put in some anti-tank. So we can come up with almost an analysis of what we can do and consider that. Well, we can get, a 5-1. 2-1 and a 5-1. You can sort of say, well, that's good, but this 2-1 is a bit risky, so we can maybe only take 2 units out. So maybe we want to keep that as the 2-1 and have a 4-1 and a 4-1. And again, it depends on what else we've got. I mean, we've got some anti-tank, but they're not particularly close, and they should actually be ranged, but they haven't got those details. But similarly down here, now this is a big stack of 6. We won't actually really be able to attack that because we don't have the odds. In case you're not aware, these are irregular units, which means they're only a 1. But when they're up against anything that's totaled, and I can never remember the exact rules. I'm pretty sure there is an exact way of defining it, but I keep forgetting. Basically, if they're under 5, you get boosted up to 5. So if I was to attack this with this 1 unit, it's not a 1-2 odds because I become a 5 because I'm a regular. I'm performing differently. I'm not working in the same way as an organised infantry company would in a more sort of structural manner. Not to say that they're stupid, but I got this from reading some books about how the Afghan irregular forces worked and how they would work quite small teams. And they're almost like special forces. Obviously, they don't have the equipment and the full training, but they will specifically set up. For example, they'll have someone that will go forward into the advanced position, dressed up as a camel herder or something, and he's there to just sort of spot the situation. And obviously, if it's a small company, it's more doable. Just a small group of men, maybe 20 or 30 men, up against a company of maybe 200 men. But he'll sort of spot and assess the situation, and then they'll split up into sort of various teams. One team will take a bit of high ground, and an infantry company could do this, but it's more involved, and they don't necessarily behave, in that exact sort of way, more sort of blunt and direct force. But so they'll maybe take 2 or 3 people up to a bit of high land where they can get sniper fire down on this sort of area. They might have another group whose role will be to basically assault the front sort of approach to this force, maybe driving along a track here with a car loaded with IEDs, and maybe although this is not an insurgent unit, something along those lines, maybe just driving straight up, dressed up as accountants or something, and then when they get to the point, they just open fire and create chaos. But at the same time, they've got some people that have moved behind, and they'll have one little unit of 3 or 4 men that will actually be in reserve, that will actually respond to any weaknesses in their strategy, and that's how they're working, and they become quite effective, which is why they don't have zones of control and are not affected by zones of control. But that's why they get this 5, and that's the whole premise of sort of the modelling of asynchronous activity in this sort of on this platform Warblog. So we can actually we can attack that 2 to 1. Now, once these become sizable, you can't operate the same sorts of things, and so these are actually, although they're sort of companies, it's a bit odd. They're not particularly strong. I've given them stronger ones. A lot of these UN situations, I give them just one companies just to represent sort of a bunch of people that probably rather be somewhere else. But here I've given them these to give them a little more of a formidable front line. But here, because there's 6, we just don't get those skills. So if we went up against that, we wouldn't have the 5. We'd be a 1, so it'd be 1 to 6. So defensively, to cater for these against irregulars, you need to have a large body of troops. And once you've got that large body, the irregulars become almost useless. The only thing that they can do, another thing that they can do is they can block a road. So, even if you had 1 million strength here, if you moved into here and you attacked it, they've got a far less chance of getting a DE. And if they get a DE, far less chance of it being activated and actually being eliminated. They generally will slow an advance by constantly falling back, but presenting a sort of an obstacle en route, whereas an infantry unit will not behave in the same way. It will take attrition much quicker. It won't. If it gets a DE, the chances of it being eliminated are much higher. Although nothing, when it gets a DE, is actually eliminated. It just means there's a chance of it being eliminated. It used to be that you could get a DE, so you could get, for example, 7 to 1 against this, pretty much get a DE, and that's the end of it. And it was just too powerful because you're blowing units up left, right, and centre. So the DE is just a DR with the chance of an elimination. But of course, there's all the morale checks as well, so there is morale in all of this. So, but those are all the finer details. Essentially, what we've got is this situation here where we've basically got, we've got this here, but if we just consider these 3 units, in particular how to get there, now that's a 6. So what we really need is some kind of indirect fire, but we don't think we really have anything. And we've got I thought we had artillery. But I must have just completely forgotten to put it in. So you might want to sort of sit there and say, oh, okay, irregulars, anti-tank. You might want to say, well, hang on, now that we start to consider the implications and the I don't know, the sort of the nitty gritty of what's happening, you say, well, this is untenable because we can't really assault this line. This is a far cry from sort of just saying, oh, right, we're playing this, so what we've got there, that's a weak one, I'll just take that. You start to sort of assess it, and you say, okay, if I was presenting a report to, my senior Houthi commander, so to speak, in sort of like the game sense, you might say, well, this is actually not doable, or you'd say, well, I need a plan. Quite often in the Iran-Iraq wars, the commanders would have to present a plan to the Shah for the, obviously the major assaults, and there was a lot of debate over, how they came up with those plans because they were actually not very good. A lot of them were based on the will of Allah, because obviously it would work because Allah wanted it to work, and so it was more a case of just throwing everything against the enemy line, and the plans were sort of followed a different methodology, as you might expect, but in this sense, if you were to sort of, that's what I often say, if you were to take any situation like this and then you were to apply, say, a competent, say, commander, I would say from the West, but it could be from China or from Russia, how would they do it? And things could be very different. You might find that, this offensive line isn't wholly synchronous in the way it behaves and its activity, in the way that the fighting in I can't remember, I think in Grozny was, we had lots of anti-tank units running around, and they're really, really good at taking out Soviet tanks, but they couldn't work on ensemble. They couldn't work together as a sort of, a composite sort of defending force. So they were unable to sort of do any sort of waves of counterattacks. It was just sort of, the anti-tank teams and the way they went around taking out the tanks individually. They were really, really good. But they couldn't do a sort of a grand assault or anything like that. And so you've got to consider all of these things and sort of say, well, what would happen if someone else was in charge? How would other people do it? For example, I'm always sort of lamenting the absence of air mobile operations in these situations. And obviously the Houthis don't have that, but you might have thought that the Houthis would, with their Saudi support. You don't hear of like paradrops, behind enemy lines cutting off road supplies. They just don't seem to do that. They didn't do it in Libya. I'm not seeing much of that sort of stuff in any of these Middle East areas. I mean, they did apparently a combined attack on the port, I think, at I think it was Sirte, where they used the Air Force, the Navy, Frogmen, and ground units to march on the port, and I think they landed in some air mobile units first, but that might be my imagination. I seem to sort of recall reading something along those lines, that they had every form of every branch of military engaged in that operation. But the thing is, you don't see that. So you might have thought, well, if we had air mobile, or if we had some sort of mechanized formation, we would be able to do something different. For example, in the Iraq war, they had the highway to hell, or highway of hell. We could say, okay, well, we're going to bring down 4 battalions of tanks and mechanized units down this road, and all we're going to do is we just want to take this road out, and then we're just going to pile straight through here like a blitzkrieg straight down here, forgetting about securing everything behind us, and then just take Marib out and fill the space in afterwards. So you've got to sort of consider, what is happening and what's not happening and what's absent. We don't have that sort of stuff. It is quite deliberately all small irregular units with the occasional motorized units, because a lot of these are on foot, walking around in sandals, chewing chat or whatever it is, with and these particular units, these ATGMs, they'll quite often use these ATGMs quite sort of specifically for taking out piles of rubble. So this might be a hill or a heightened point, and they've got a dry stone wall. Again, it's something I'm quite critical on with regards to how they do all these things. You might have thought they'd be flying precast concrete, defensive structures in, have something to do that. I mean, I've just read about Biden cancelling a multi-billion-dollar defensive deal with Saudi Arabia, in consideration in relation to this war. And you sort of think, well, if they've got all that money, and quite often you'll see that money going up in flames as brand new armoured vehicles are set alight by the Houthis, you might have thought, well, what else could they be doing? I mean, and I'm not saying that this precast concrete idea of mine is fantastic, but when you look at these defensive features they have, they're just dry stone walls, and you might have thought that they could actually come up with, say, some sort of dynamic and rapid response to creating, better defensive structures. For example, I can't remember what it is, Bin Menfu, the Chinese, or where it was, Viet Cong, or I don't know. They basically they tunneled into the mountains and put their artillery positions basically in caves that poked out the front, making them almost invincible. But you sort of thought, well, why can't they do things like that in this war? And it comes down to, you've got to conclude that they're not actually very good at it. They're not doing the same. And that's why I'm saying, if you were to paradrop some senior advanced intelligent commanders into these things, what would they do? I think back at the Libya situation and the advance of the LNA. I mean, they were very nearly on Tripoli, and then they lost it all. It was quite unbelievable, really, from a military and from a sort of kinetic perspective of how that all happened. And you sort of think, well, they were only sort of a drive away. They were only 20-minute drive away from the heart of Tripoli, I think. And what happened? How could they not do that? What was so impenetrable about the defensive lines that made it impossible to blast through? Like the highway to hell situation. Running the gauntlet through all the ATGMs, etc., and just getting there with a power drop into, or an air mobile bridge into Tripoli, etc., etc. And so you end up with this sort of situation where you're thinking a lot about what could be happening. And I think that's sort of part and parcel of what makes it all quite interesting. But just to sort of just reiterate on, there's a lot of ATGMs, but there's not really any sort of tanks, and they'll fire these ATGMs at these little dry stone wall features. And that's common, with how they're doing things. But obviously there's a lot of this Saudi stuff here, which they can also fire at. But we don't actually have any rockets or any artillery. Now, they tend not to do that, but I have seen some footage where the Houthis have got, say, some sort of armoured unit. And you think, hang on, why didn't they do that before? Because they're always sort of advancing on foot up these hills to take out these defensive positions. But they don't tend to sort of do what you might have thought. And they've got a tank, and he's just firing HE, precision HE into these things. And they're using a few drones and things, but I haven't put those in. So I think I might have missed a few things out, really, but this is how it's fallen at the moment. But we don't have anything like that. So we can say, well, how are we going to take that? So all of a sudden, instead of being just a complete mess, we're now weighting up the balance and finding out that this is an impenetrable force. And that could be why they didn't move any further forward, because we can't get past it. Now, I mean, to get through there, if they're 2, 4, 6 entrenched to, I can never remember what these things are, but 3 times, that would be 18. We'd need 18 of these units. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 16. We basically need everything from around here. We could probably get these hexes. We could probably scoot around 1, 2. We could probably get to there. So we could probably get 4 hexes, giving us a 30% bonus. So we'd need everything to attack that. Just getting a 1-to-1. But I think the thing to do in this instance will be to bring forward the ATGMs, to use them against these infantry positions, which is what they've been doing a lot of anyway. But they can only move 1 hex. See, that's going to be a 4, but it might be doubled up to 12 because of their position. But I can't remember whether or not we'll be a 5, whether they'll be considered to be under 5 and will be affected by our irregular factors. What I'm going to do, I quite often do this and I always forget, but I'm going to test. So I'm going to put everything like this. So it's first section of moving things. We leave all these other things. So we're doing our first assault here. But can we get any of this stuff onto that? Yes, we've got 2 anti-tank things, so maybe we shouldn't have done that. So let's fire these ATGMs into there. 0.5 on that unit. I mean, when you fire ATGMs, you're only going against 1 unit, so it's not an area fire thing. Okay, so at least they're going to have to take 2 turns to recover that. They'll recover 1, so they'll be at 0.3 next turn. Let's fire these ones into there. 0.6, 0.7. Then, so I keep forgetting how this works. I could look the rules up. I only wrote the rules, so I should know. But there are 4. So we should get 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35 against 4. Which is 7-1. But if they're actually 4, 8, 12, we're going to be a 1-2. It's a big gamble because based on my dementia. Yeah. Okay. So, and we got a DE eliminated, but they moved back to there with a depression of 3. So I was right, and they were defending on. They were a 2 up to 8 minus their point whatever because of damage for the ATGMs. So I was right. So mental note, it's the face value, not the entrenched value. But we've pushed them back. So here we know that it's going to be above 6. So I mean, that's irrelevant anyway. But we pushed them out of that defensive line, which is good. And because we're mobile, we've got another turn. And this is going to be easy to do. So let's do it again. Because basically we've got, well, their movement. Let me just clarify that for the observer. Basically, he's moved. He's got 3.4 movement left. He's got 0.4 movement. So he couldn't move, but he's still got a movement section, and so he's able to engage in combat. And there's no. It's a little foible, but there's no detriment. He's not sort of like at a quarter of his strength, even though he's only got 0.4 of his movement. It's just, it just makes it simple. But we'll probably win this again. Yeah, and I think we actually eliminated it that turn because it doesn't seem to have retreated. So in one turn, we've eliminated one unit from there and to some extent broken this. So we can almost start to move in this direction. It still doesn't really do much for this, although we've now got a little further. We've now got a few more ATGMs, in their scope. So that's pretty much that, really. I'm not going to bother with this because I spent a bit of time just talking generally, and what I'm trying to convey here, not so much convey here in this sense, I'm just having a blast really, and this is just where it's gone. But it seems to me that the sensibilities of one initiative like that are such that we can say, well, that's actually how it works, or this is how war works, and then you'd be saying, well, hang on, what's the report on that? Can we get some? I'm not saying that other games are just stupid, and this sort of analysis isn't really there. And when you're playing a game with another person, you wouldn't necessarily want to be doing that. But even so, when you're playing with another person, I always try to encourage people to have a debate about what happened. And you could say, well, okay, we had this infantry unit that was holed up in a sort of an open desert space. We had a significant and major Houthi advance that probably was reported on Twitter that forced them back. The advance was sort of echeloned in such a way that we managed to sort of to pursue them to some extent. They could have retreated here. They retreated the wrong way, and they were actually removed from the board. And elimination is actually quite difficult to do. That would have probably been, because they would have been up to 6, which means there would have been a 10% chance of a morale failure. But the elimination is actually sort of, only a 20% chance at that level, or a 10% chance. So that was quite fortuitous. So you can sort of start to say, well, you were lucky to get that elimination because otherwise he could still be there, or he could still be there. He wouldn't be there because it's a zone of control. So he might have been there. But now we've broken this gap. And just sort of being a bit tight about the sort of the implications, and it just, I think that instead of just sitting there and just moving everything, we can sort of say, well, how does that change things? Can we sue for peace now? And we can almost break through onto this road. So it means that to some extent you could say, okay, well, what's the argument? Well, the argument could be implied that this unit now doesn't have a southern flank, and that they might have to move out. They might move out of their own accord. They might move back to here, and these Saudi units might replace. They're now going to be forced to consider their defensive line across here after this just one attack. And you might sort of say, well, if there was an umpire, what would be the considerations and the implications of that? But just to sort of make it easy, because I've done 40 minutes of the video, and I don't think, and mostly people only watch 2 minutes, so I don't think anyone's actually getting this far. But one person that does watch my videos is me, and I've watched a few of my videos from sort of years ago, and I just sort of think that they're actually quite significant and worthwhile. I enjoy watching them, but I think the key thing I picked up on sort of through this temporal analysis of watching my own stuff is that it has to be sort of interesting, and the points are significant and relevant, and I sort of came to the conclusion that they are. I'm interested in what I'm saying, and I'm interested in what I'm saying 2 or 3 years down the line, because it's not sort of, it's not set in time. You can see these arguments, with the tool and the consideration, and you can still follow them like a chess move, like a chess game. You can sort of say, well, perhaps if we'd moved our bishop there, we could put the rook under stress, and that would force the king to move there, or whatever, something along those lines. But the logic and it's pervasive through time, and it still makes sense 2 or 3 years down the road. And I can quite often watch these videos when I'm falling into sleep, and so they are. It is, I think, worthwhile to sort of to do this sort of analysis, etc., etc. But I think what I'm going to do, just to sort of put that not so much to the test, but I'm going to end that turn. So to put it into perspective in another way, what I've said earlier, a few years ago now, was that what you can do as another way of playing this is to say, talking about the battle groups that I went through, so I defined all the battle groups, defined the initiatives, and then say, okay, well, this is the action I'm going to take, these are the reasons I'm going to take it, and these are the results that I want to see. Now, we're going to forget that because I don't have time. We can assume that I'm still doing that because I gave the order. We can assume that all these are now on hold. Doesn't mean we can't move forward. We might move these to there and hold there. We might shuffle a lot of these things around to hold better, but we're not doing the major attacks, although we could hold by attacking. But so it's all quite flexible. But we'd never be sort of trying to sort of move there and drive this down and take this chunk out. That's not the order we've given. But here we've done that offensive, and so we're just going to move on now to the Houthi turn and say, well, okay, what's the situation that they're going to do now? One thing that should be quite apparent: they've got a lot of air power. We might have forgotten about that. So obviously we've broken this flank, and my initial instinct is, especially considering it's 42 minutes, is to just say, right, I'm going to put all my air power onto this stack. But the thing is, I think, and I'm not going to go through all of this, you do the same thing with defining your battle groups, but you'd be thinking differently. You're thinking from the Houthi perspective, and trying to form a defensive line. So we could say, well, how can we defend here? Where should this unit go? Should we go north, west, south, or should he stay there? What about these? Which direction are these going to go as a sort of strategic reserve? Are we going to fall back with this? Fall back everything by 2 spaces? What are the potentials? What's the possibilities? Well, we're not going to go into all of that, because that's what this game is all about, is to sort of allow you to sort of consider that. And quite often, you might be considering it in your mind without verbalizing it, but clearly the drawing tool is there to help you do that visually. I think here, I sort of think, well, what has actually happened from the Houthi perspective? Was that a great failure? So on paper, they were saying, well, this unit routed, this unit was eliminated, and that would be a bit of a shock, I think, because I would imagine that he should be there. But we do have certain reserve. I mean, they're deliberately spaced out on this road as though they're in convoy. But we've got almost a sort of like a battalion of, almost a regiment. I mean, if you had a very weak, if this was, it would be a battalion, would it? But if this was 2 battalions, so it'd be 2, 3 battalions. It's almost a regiment of motorized units, then they could come up and form a solid line. You know, but the potential that they could do that is something different. And we've got all this artillery. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the artillery means that one, two, three, four, 5. You know, there is a sort of defensive line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, like that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, so we've got this sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've got this field of fire. So once we fall back beyond this hex, we've got that defensive fire in support. So we could sort of move back because there's no point in holding that position, but we have held it because we've probably just been pushed out of Kissarat. Maybe that's what's happened. But we've got these units, and the thing is, we've demonstrated the power of these irregular units. But what we're looking at here to some extent is their weakness, because we could probably use these as long as we can keep them grouped together as a sort of, you know, battalion. They could probably just go and sit there and suffer absolutely no results from these. Now, the thing that you've got to bear in mind, the only danger you've got with something like that, considering something like that, is that if we were to sit there and they surrounded it by moving there and there, all they need is a DR to destroy all of that. So you can't get surrounded, because even if they they might try a 1 to 2 attack, just in the hope of getting the DR result, because if they can, it's everything. But so for example, you know, you've got this situation here where now they're worth 4 because there's 2 of them. They're only worth 1, so that's a 4 to 1 attack. So they're actually quite weak. Here we could move presumably along here, attack that, move into there, attack that. You know, once you get into the sort of situation, you realise that these regular units are actually quite weak and subject to a counter attack. So we've got this big stack here of 3, and it looks quite impressive with an offensive capability of 15. But on their own, they're worth nothing. So we've got 6 here versus 3. So that would be we've been hit a bit. So that would be basically a 2 to 1, probably down to 1 to 1 because of their depressions. But if we could bring this in, you know, that would be another one. That would be a 2 to 1, and the 10% bonus might put it up to a 4 to 1. So we could probably get quite a significant attack on that. And because of the time, I'm going to sort of speed things up a bit. I'm not going to think too far into the Hadi turn because I'm sort of a bit tired now. But what I'm saying is I'm tempted to just put all my air power onto this, but I never do that because I think it's a bit not gamey really. It's a bit of a gameplay in that, you know, the air power should be spread along the line. So I would never put more than 50% when it's this many units. If I only had 2 units, I could say I'd use it all on this stack. Because there's so many of them, I might be able to put 3 on here. But, you know, I would say, okay, well, what am I going to do, and what's my reason for doing that? Well, I maybe want to sort of maybe keep some pressure on this camp and take out what's in there. But what I think I'm going to do is, just for the sake of it, I'm going to try moving my mechanized. They might not get that far. I'm going to put 3 air power onto this. I'm going to put the other 2 air power onto something else that's not too sort of near. I'm going to use it on these. So I'm going to put 1 on this unit and 1 on this, just to sort of demonstrate that I think you've got to be playing, you know, with a certain degree of not so much realism, but, you know, it makes sense that you might want to sort of target these anti-tank, these ATGM units, because they've been firing into our troops here. So we've probably got calls in for air support to take them out. So we're going to do that. So let's just see. So we've still got Right, so I'm going to have 3 against that. Probably don't actually need them, but I said I would, so that's that. And I'm going to do my ground attack. So 1.4, 1.6, 0.8. So they're going to be about 1.5, 15% down. So they're worth about 3. They're going to be worth about, let's say 2.5. And we've got a few here. So 1, so it's going to be a 2 to 1, 3, 4, 5 to 1, possibly a 5 or a 6 to 1. Yep. And we've got a DE on them. So we've now pushed quite conveniently a very nice line along there. I'm not going to do this attack on these units because I'm going to end it there. It's 50 minutes. Because I just want to sit there and sort of say, well, what's happened here overall? I mean, obviously, I mean, not everyone's going to want to play a game in the way I'm demonstrating it, or even agree with what I'm saying. But I think that what we've got is a very nice demarked line there. We could attack that and possibly get him to retreat to there, making it, no zones of control touching. But we've now sort of reinforced that line, that road, and making it almost impenetrable, etc., etc. And now you can sort of, if you understand that sort of the hexagon, the hexagonology or whatever, to any greater extent, you can sort of sense, well, these are quite formidable as a fighting force moving forward, but they're not very good at holding that ground, and we just push them back, giving them sort of fairly significant damage. And now they've actually reinforced here with these mechanized units. Obviously we're going to try and take these out, but I don't think there's going to be a lot of damage. Let's see how much damage they actually do. .1. Yeah, they're quite good against things like this in the open. So these little guys are 80 GMs, and these Saudi tornadoes have come in with their smart missiles, blowing them all to hell, so to speak. 20% there, 10% there. So, I mean, whatever. The thing to bear in mind is there were air defences involved. They flew through a gamut of 4 air defense units, which would have been sort of just flak, 50 cal or whatever. But they can lose these things, and if you start losing your air power early on in the game, it can actually hurt. You need to maintain the air defense, the air superiority on, going forward. And the air side of things is basically in this war is pretty much what the Saudi player are doing. They're not really doing a lot of offensive ground movements, maybe because they just don't want to be losing people. And it's all quite controversial, really, the use of air power, because obviously they're blowing up not necessarily all military units, and particularly when they're targeting bridges and things, which is designated sort of civilian infrastructure, which means that they're actually war crimes. I mean, I think in Market Garden they would have maybe considered it somewhere else. The dam busters, they're not necessarily all following the same sort of moral ethic codes, etc., etc. But the thing is, we've now pushed them back here, and you could sort of say, okay, well, what actually happened in reality? Well, in reality, they're still as they are. They didn't move forward. So maybe what we've just done there is model almost exactly what they did. Maybe they tried, maybe they had some luck, but they were pushed back quickly, and maybe the losses that they incurred there were 3.8, 4.4. They were almost 50%, 40 to 50% down on their numbers, and maybe that's enough for them to say, no, we're not doing it anymore. But you don't get that sensibility in wargaming that much. You don't say, oh, some people died, let's not do this anymore. But when they're on the ground and you're dealing with these sorts of forces, especially in this day and age, when soldiers don't bother turning up for duty because they might get hurt, um, you might consider that they're not going to do that anymore. They're just going to sit here and fire 80 GMs. So they're going to fire the 80 GMs into here. They're going to be doing airstrikes onto all of these units, and it's going to be a stalemate. But I think that a lot of it would pan out as to what sort of damage the air power could do, because I suspect that they'll probably attrition the Houthis more than the Houthis would attrition the Hadis, etc., etc. But again, there's not always, you would then have some sort of rules and limits as to how many airstrikes you could have, because you could say, well, it's obviously quite expensive. But the bottom line is that they haven't advanced, and this could be, we could have done a perfect simulation of what's happening, or what had happened, and what has happened, and to give us an understanding of the position that we're in now. There's all sorts of things about, I can never remember what state of play is about ceasefires, and it could be that there's a ceasefire as well. I know that they're sort of, intimating that the Saudis are continually thwarting ceasefires. I don't know. I'd have to maybe look it up, see what. Maybe there was a ceasefire and that's why I didn't go through. But there's always sort of other things to consider. The politics, the ceasefires, the weather, things like COVID, supply and logistics that come in to factor into sort of why they didn't do things, not just the kinetics of whether this is a good defensive line or not, etc., etc. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. I did sort of maybe intend to make it just play the game, but I've sort of fallen into maybe my own little trap. Let's do this little attack here. We'll come out of our defences, but let's do this artillery. I'm not going to move the artillery first. Yeah, so we pushed him back, and we pushed him back to there, now creating that nice little space, that buffer zone, almost all along here, and we can get 2-to-1 against him. We're not going to do any of that, but I think it gives you a nice indication or an idea of how things work and how things could work, etc., etc. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll speak to you later. Cheerio.